Precision is the only thing that separates a surgeon from a butcher. In my line of work, the margin for error is measured in millimeters, and the stakes are usually someone's ability to walk, grip a coffee mug, or hold their child. I spend my days in a theater of fluorescent lights and sterile blue drapes, repairing the structural failures of the human body. It is a world governed by physics and biology, where every action has an equal and opposite reaction. I like the predictability of it. If a bone is shattered, I fix it with titanium and screws. If a joint is worn, I replace it. There is no room for ambiguity when you are elbow deep in ephemeral reconstruction. I was in the scrub room when the shift ended, the smell of antiseptic clinging to my skin like a second layer of clothing. My hands were steady, as they always are. I checked my watch, 6:14 p.m. It was a Tuesday, which meant my daughter, Maya, was at her grandparents' house for her weekly overnight visit. It was a tradition that had started shortly after my wife, Elena, had walked out of our lives 3 years ago without a single footprint left in the snow. Elena's departure had been a master class in clean breaks. No note, no bank account drain, just an empty space in the bed and a vacuum where a mother should be. The police had called it a voluntary disappearance. I had called it a betrayal of physics. People don't just cease to exist. But after 1,000 days of silence, even a surgeon learns to live with a phantom limb. I pulled my phone from my locker and saw a missed FaceTime request from Maya. I dialed back immediately, leaning against the cold metal of the lockers. Her face filled the screen, bright, wide-eyed, and missing a front tooth. She was sitting in the sunroom of my in-laws' sprawling colonial home, the kind of house built on old money and older secrets. "Daddy, look what Grandma made," she chirped, holding up a plate of cookies that looked suspiciously store-bought. "Those look like they have a high sugar-to-happiness ratio, Maya," I said, my voice slipping into that dry, rhythmic tone she enjoyed. "Don't eat more than 3, or you'll be vibrating through the floorboards." "Grandpa says I can have 5, she countered, grinning. The camera tilted as she moved, giving me a fleeting glimpse of the hallway. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that exists in museums or churches. My father-in-law, Arthur, was a man of immense social standing and even larger silences. My mother-in-law, Lydia, was the curator of his reputation. They had been my pillars after Elena left, the grieving grandparents who shared my confusion and helped me raise a child who was suddenly half-orphaned. "Where are they now?" I asked. "In the kitchen. They're talking to a friend," Maya said. She set the phone down on the glass table, the lens pointing toward the ceiling's crown molding. "I'm going to go get my book. Stay there, okay?" "I'm not going anywhere, kiddo." I waited, listening to the distant sound of her sneakers retreating on the hardwood. Then, I heard it. The phone must have shifted or slid, because the audio suddenly became sharper, catching the resonance of the hallway. There were voices, high, agitated, and entirely too familiar. "You can't keep her in the guest suite forever, Lydia," a man's voice said. It was Arthur, his tone stripped of its usual professional polish. "The girl is 8. She's starting to ask why the door stays locked when we have company." "She isn't company, Arthur. She's our daughter," a woman replied. The sound of my heart didn't change its rhythm. I am trained for crises. I am trained for the moment the monitor flatlines or the artery nicks. My mind began to process the data with the cold efficiency of a diagnostic computer. The voice was Elena's. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a memory. It was the specific, melodic cadence of the woman I had spent 3 years mourning, coming from the kitchen of the people who had held my hand at her memorial service. "He's going to find out," Arthur snapped. "He's a surgeon, for heaven's sake. The man notices everything. He's been coming here every week for years, and you think we can just keep this partition up indefinitely?" "He believes what he wants to believe," Elena's voice said, and there was a sharpness to it now, a lack of the warmth I remembered. "He's so focused on his charts and his repairs that he never sees the cracks in the foundation. He never did." Then, a heavy thud. The phone on the glass table must have been knocked by a breeze or a vibration. It fell. The screen went dark, but the audio remained active for 3 more seconds. "Who left this here?" Lydia's voice, sharp and panicked. "Is this his? Is he on?" Silence. The connection didn't just end. It severed. I stared at the black screen of my phone. The locker room was suddenly too bright, the smell of antiseptic too cloying. My brain was already calculating the distance. 340 miles, mostly highway. If I left now, I could be there by dawn. I didn't call back. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone against the metal lockers. I simply walked to my car, my movements fluid and deliberate. I am a man of strategy. I understand that when a structure is compromised, you do not simply slap a bandage on it. You have to understand the extent of the rot. You have to see where the weight is distributed. The drive was a blur of gray asphalt and red taillights. The sarcasm that usually served as my armor felt thinner now, replaced by a cold, pressurized clarity. My in-laws, my wife, a 3-year conspiracy of silence. They had watched me struggle. They had watched Maya cry herself to sleep in the early months. They had accepted my gratitude, my holidays, and my financial contributions to Maya's future fund, all while the missing piece of the puzzle was sitting in their guest suite, sipping tea and waiting for the coast to be clear. The betrayal was so vast, it was almost beautiful in its architecture. It required a level of coordination that most families couldn't manage for a Thanksgiving dinner. This was a long game, and if they were playing a long game, I would have to play a longer one. I pulled into the driveway at 4:15 a.m. The rain had started an hour outside of the city, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the manicured lawn into a swamp. The house was dark, except for a single light in the sunroom. I stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through my thin dress shirt. I didn't care. I walked up the stone path, my eyes fixed on the porch. There, sitting on a wicker chair, was Maya. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her small frame shaking. She wasn't crying, which was worse. She was staring out at the driveway with an expression of profound, adult exhaustion. She looked like she had aged a decade in the few hours since our call. "Maya," I said softly. She jumped, her eyes widening as she saw me. She didn't run to me. She stayed frozen for a moment, then stood up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders like a shroud. "Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was thin, brittle. "You shouldn't be here." "I came to get you, kiddo. Let's go to the car." I reached for her hand, but she pulled back, looking at the heavy oak front door. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the porch roof. "They're inside," she said. "All of them. They're having breakfast. Grandma said it was a surprise, but it doesn't feel like a surprise." She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the reflection of the lie in her eyes. She knew. They had shown her. They had probably spent the last several hours explaining to her why her father was the enemy, or why their deceit was actually an act of love. "Please don't go inside," she said, her voice trembling. "Just, please don't go in there." "Why not, Maya?" "Because," she said, a single tear finally escaping. "If you go in, you can't come back out the same. That's what Grandpa said. He said you wouldn't understand." I looked at the door. I could see the faint glow of the kitchen lights through the frosted glass. I could imagine them sitting there. Arthur with his newspaper, Lydia with her silver teapot, and Elena, who had supposedly been a memory, sitting there in the flesh, eating toast and discussing the weather. I felt a surge of something cold and sharp, like a surgical blade. They thought they knew me. They thought I was a man of predictable reactions, a man who would either break or explode. They didn't realize that I am a man who reconstructs things. And before you can reconstruct, you often have to finish the demolition. I didn't listen to her. I couldn't. I placed a hand on the brass knob. It was unlocked. They were waiting for me. Or perhaps they were so arrogant they didn't think I'd arrive so soon. I turned the handle and pushed. The warmth of the house hit me first, scented with cinnamon and expensive floor wax. It was a lie of a smell. I walked through the foyer, my wet shoes marking the pristine rugs. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance to the kitchen. They were all there. Arthur was at the head of the table. Lydia was pouring tea, and sitting next to her, wearing a sweater I had bought her for her 35th birthday, was my wife. She looked well rested. She looked happy. She looked up at me and didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She didn't even look guilty. "You're early, David," she said, her voice as calm as a summer pond. "We were just talking about you." I looked at the three of them, the architects of my ruin. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. I realized then that this wasn't the end of a tragedy. It was the beginning of an operation. And I was the only one in the room who knew how to use the tools. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over a trauma bay after a failed resuscitation. It is not peaceful. It is a vacuum. It is the sound of expensive equipment humming while the air remains heavy with the weight of what just occurred. Standing in my in-laws' kitchen, I felt that same vacuum. Elena looked at me with a terrifyingly placid expression, as if she had simply stepped out for a gallon of milk 3 years ago instead of abandoning her life. My hands, tucked into the pockets of my damp coat, remained perfectly still. I did not give them the satisfaction of a tremor. "You're early, David," she repeated. The sound of my name in her voice felt like a phantom limb sensation, a sharp, localized ache for something that was no longer there. "I have a habit of efficiency," I said. My voice was a dry rasp, but it held. I didn't look at Arthur or Lydia. I kept my focus on Elena. She looked healthy. Her skin was clear, her hair was a shade lighter than I remembered, and she wore a gold watch that I hadn't purchased for her. It was a gift from the people sitting beside her. "We were going to tell you," Lydia said, her voice trembling with a manufactured fragility. She reached for her teacup, her rings clinking against the fine china. "We were waiting for the right moment. The transition had to be handled with care." 3 years is a very long moment, Lydia," I replied. I turned my gaze to Arthur. He was the one who usually handled the logistics of the family. He sat with his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on a point just above my head. He was a man who believed that if you ignored a problem with enough dignity, it would eventually solve itself. "It was a private matter," Arthur said, his tone authoritative. "Elena needed a period of reflection. We provided the environment for that. You were preoccupied with your career. We didn't want to disrupt Maya's stability until we were certain of the path forward." The audacity of the statement was almost impressive. They had stolen 3 years of a child's life with her mother, and 3 years of my reality, under the guise of stability. I thought of Maya sitting on the porch in the rain, shaking under a wool blanket. My protective instinct didn't manifest as a roar, it manifested as a blueprint. I saw the lines of their lives, the connections of their finances, the structure of their social standing, and I saw exactly where the weight-bearing walls were located. "I see," I said. I didn't argue. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't ask where she had been or who she had been with. To ask questions is to admit that you lack the information, and I was already beginning to gather everything I needed. "Maya is in the car. We're leaving." "David, don't be irrational," Elena said, standing up. "She's exhausted. She needs to sleep. We can talk about the logistics of the reunion after breakfast." "The reunion is over," I said. I stepped back toward the foyer. "Maya and I are leaving. You will stay here. If any of you attempt to approach the vehicle, I will consider it an interference with my daughter's safety. We can discuss the legalities of your coordinated silence through the appropriate channels." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the house. The cool air of the morning was a relief against the stifling warmth of the kitchen. I walked to the car, where Maya was curled up in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the dashboard. I got in, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway without looking at the house in the rearview mirror. We drove for 2 hours in total silence. I didn't head home. Home was a compromise. Home was where the memories of the lie lived. Instead, I drove to a motel 2 towns over, a clean, nondescript place where no one knew our names. I checked us into a room with 2 double beds and the smell of industrial lavender. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, her feet dangling. "Is Mommy coming back?" she asked. Her voice was small, stripped of the curiosity that usually defined her. "She was never gone, Maya," I said, kneeling in front of her. I took her hands in mine. They were warm now. "She was just hiding, and people who hide aren't looking to be found. But you and I? We aren't going to hide. We're going to find a new way to be a family." "I don't like Grandma anymore," she whispered. "That is a very logical conclusion," I said. I waited until she fell into a deep, heavy sleep before I allowed myself to move. I sat at the small laminate desk in the corner of the room, my laptop open, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. I am an orthopedic surgeon. I understand the importance of imaging. You cannot fix a fracture until you see the full extent of the displacement. I began with the bank accounts. Elena had left with nothing, or so I had thought. But as I dug through the digital archives of our joint history, I found the breadcrumbs I had been too distracted to see 3 years ago. Small, consistent transfers to a holding company I didn't recognize. The company's address was a P.O. box in a town only 20 miles from my in-laws' estate. It wasn't a disappearance, it was a relocation. She hadn't been in a guest suite for 3 years. She had been living a parallel life, funded by her parents and facilitated by a network of friends who had looked me in the eye at benefit galas and expressed their deepest sympathies. Every one of them had known. Every one of them had watched me play the grieving husband, while they likely laughed at my blindness behind closed doors. I felt a cold, surgical detachment take hold. This was no longer about a marriage. This was about a systemic failure of trust that required a systemic response. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want a reunion. I wanted to see the structure of their lives crumble until they were standing in the dust of their own arrogance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wedding ring. It was a simple platinum band, heavy and cold. I looked at it for a long moment, remembering the day I had placed it on my finger. I had promised to protect her. I had promised to build a life. She had taken that promise and used it as a distraction while she dismantled our foundation from within. I walked into the motel bathroom and placed the ring on the tile floor. I took the heavy ceramic base of the desk lamp and, with a single controlled strike, I flattened the band. It didn't break. It merely deformed, the perfect circle becoming an ugly, jagged oval. It was no longer a symbol of a union. It was a piece of scrap metal. I tossed it into the trash can. The next step was the social network. I opened my contacts and began to sort. There were the colleagues who had been supportive, the friends who had genuinely cared, and then there were the others. The ones who belonged to the same country club as Arthur. The ones who had invited Elena to private gatherings while I was in the operating room. I began to draft a series of messages. They were not angry. They were not accusatory. They were professional inquiries sent from my hospital email address asking for clarification on certain financial discrepancies I had discovered during a routine audit of my estate. I knew the moment those emails hit their inboxes, the panic would begin. In a community built on reputation, an audit is a threat. A surgeon asking questions about money is a man who is looking for a reason to cut. I spent the rest of the night mapping out the connections. I used a notepad from the motel bedside table to draw a diagram of the betrayal. At the center were Arthur and Lydia. Radiating out were the legal firms they used, the social circles they dominated, and the small private school where they had been grooming Maya to follow in their footsteps. I saw the vulnerabilities. Arthur's firm was currently undergoing a sensitive merger. Lydia was the chairperson of a historical preservation society that relied heavily on public image and private donations. Elena was the most vulnerable of all, because she had spent 3 years living a lie that required absolute secrecy to maintain. I didn't need to break the law to ruin them. I just needed to introduce the truth into their sterile environment and watch the infection spread. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light over the motel parking lot, I stood up and stretched. My back ached, and my eyes were dry, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I looked at Maya, still sleeping soundly, unaware that her father was no longer the man who fixed broken bones. I was now the man who broke things that couldn't be fixed. I walked to the window and looked out at my car. It was covered in a layer of road salt and grime, but it was sturdy. It was a vehicle for the journey ahead. I realized then that my silence over the last few hours hadn't been a sign of shock. It had been the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. They had underestimated me because I am a man of science and logic. They thought my restraint was a weakness. They thought my dedication to my work meant I was oblivious to the world around me. They were about to learn that the same precision I used to save lives could be used to dismantle them. I picked up the phone and made my first call. It wasn't to a lawyer, and it wasn't to the police. It was to a private investigator I had worked with on a medical malpractice case 2 years ago. A man who knew how to find the things people worked very hard to bury. "I have a project for you," I said when he answered. "It's a reconstruction. But first, we need to do a thorough inspection of the wreckage." The game had changed. The pieces were on the board, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the one making the moves. I looked back at the trash can where the flattened ring lay hidden beneath a pile of paper. It was the first of many things that would be discarded before this was over. The architecture of a secret is only as strong as its weakest point of contact. In my world, we call it a stress fracture, a hairline crack that appears insignificant until you apply a specific amount of torque. By the time I dropped Maya off at a trusted colleague's house under the guise of an emergency surgical rotation, I had already identified 3 such points. These were the secondary betrayers, the people who didn't design the lie but were more than happy to help maintain its structural integrity for a fee or a favor. The first was Marcus Thorne. Marcus was an estate attorney and a man I had considered a friend for 15 years. We had gone through residency and law school in the same city, shared scotch on Friday nights, and he had been the one to review the legalities of Elena's disappearance. He had sat in my living room, nursing a glass of expensive peat-heavy whiskey, and told me that looking for her was a futile exercise in misery. He had guided me toward accepting the status quo, ensuring I didn't hire a private investigator too early or push the local authorities too hard. I didn't go to his office. I didn't want the formality of mahogany desks and assistants. I waited for him in the parking structure of his high-rise apartment complex at 9 p.m. It was a concrete cavern, echoing with the hum of ventilation fans and the distant screech of tires on the street below. I sat in my car, the engine off, watching the elevator bank. When Marcus appeared, he looked exactly like the success story he was. Tailored coat, leather briefcase, the brisk walk of a man who believed his time was the most valuable commodity in the room. He reached his silver sedan and clicked the fob. The lights flashed, a brief burst of amber in the shadows. I stepped out of my car. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. I simply stood there, 10 feet away, and watched him. "Marcus," I said. My voice was low, carrying through the concrete space with the precision of a sonar pulse. He jumped, his briefcase clipping the side of his car. He squinted into the gloom, his expression shifting from annoyance to a sudden, visible, hollowed-out look. He recognized the silhouette. He recognized the stillness. "David, what the hell are you doing here? You scared me," he said, trying to force a laugh that faded in his throat. He didn't move toward me. He didn't offer a hand. The distance between us was the physical manifestation of 3 years of lies. "I had a very interesting breakfast today, Marcus," I said, taking 2 deliberate steps forward. "At Arthur's house, in the kitchen. Do you know who was there?" He fumbled with his keys, his knuckles white. He didn't ask who. He didn't play the game of confusion. He knew the structural collapse had begun. "David, listen, it's complicated. There were reasons. Privacy concerns, legal protections. I'm not interested in the reasons for the rot, Marcus. I'm interested in the scope of it." I moved closer, entering the halo of the overhead light. I didn't touch him. I didn't have to. I am a surgeon. I know how to occupy space in a way that feels clinical and invasive. You filed the paperwork. You moved the funds. You ensured that every time I thought about looking deeper, there was a legal barrier in my way. You didn't just hide her. You trapped me in a narrative you knew was false. "I was representing a client," he stammered, his back hitting the door of his car. "Arthur is a major account for the firm. I had obligations." "You had a friend?" I said. The word sounded foreign as it left my mouth. "But now you have a liability. I've already contacted the ethics board regarding a conflict of interest in the management of my family's estate. I've also sent a summary of our consultations over the last 3 years to your senior partners. I believe the term they'll use is gross professional misconduct." The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sallow under the harsh garage lights. He knew as well as I did that in his world, a reputation for being a loyal fixer was only valuable as long as the fixing stayed quiet. The moment it became a public audit, he was nothing more than a breach of contract. "David, don't do this. We can talk about a settlement. We can fix this." "You don't fix a shattered bone by talking to it, Marcus. You realign it. Often that requires breaking the surrounding tissue to get to the core." I leaned in, my face inches from his. I could smell the expensive coffee and the sour scent of his burgeoning panic. "I want the ledger. Every transfer, every shell company, every person who took a check to keep their mouth shut. I want it by tomorrow morning. If I don't have it, the next person I talk to won't be a senior partner. It will be the press." I left him there, leaning against his silver car, a man who had built his life on the stability of other people's secrets and was now realizing the roof was coming down. I spent the next several hours in my office at the hospital. It was the only place where I felt in control. I sat at my desk, surrounded by anatomical models and textbooks on reconstructive techniques. I began to map the next phase. The ledger Marcus would provide, and he would provide it, because men like Marcus always choose survival over loyalty, would give me the names. But I didn't need names to understand the social cost. I opened a file on my computer. I began to cross-reference Arthur's business associates with the guest lists of the charity events Elena had supposedly missed. It was a closed loop, the same 50 people, the same 3 legal firms, the same 2 banks. It was a village of high flyers who had all agreed to ignore the person hiding in the center of the square. The next point of torque was Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was the best friend who had sat on my sofa and cried with me 6 months after Elena left. She was the one who had taken Maya for weekends when I was overwhelmed. She was also the one who, according to my recent digital deep dive, had been checking into a boutique hotel in the city at the same time Elena was reflecting in her parents' guest suite. I didn't confront Sarah with words. I sent her a gift. I used a courier service to deliver a package to her home. Inside was a framed photograph of her and Elena from 5 years ago, but I had removed the glass and replaced the photo with a printed copy of her own cell phone records from the previous July, records I had obtained through a contact in digital forensics. I highlighted one specific number that appeared 42 times in a single week. The number belonged to a burner phone registered to Arthur's office. I attached a small, typed note. The lens sees everything eventually. I hope the view was worth the cost. By midnight, my phone began to vibrate. First Marcus, then Sarah, then a series of numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. I set the phone on the desk and watched it light up the room, a rhythmic, silent pulse of desperation. They were all talking now. The network was vibrating. The panic I had introduced was spreading through the system like a contagion. I stood up and walked to the window of my office, looking out over the city. The hospital was a fortress of logic in a world of chaos. Below me, thousands of people were sleeping, their lives held together by the assumption that the ground wouldn't move beneath them. My in-laws had spent 3 years ensuring my ground was a treadmill, keeping me running in place while they moved the world around me. I thought about the physical revenge Arthur expected. He likely thought I would show up with a weapon or a lawsuit. He expected a confrontation he could manage with security guards or high-priced litigators. He didn't understand that I wasn't looking for a settlement. I was looking for an erasure. I began to draft the final part of the evening's work. I reached out to the head of the hospital's board of directors. I informed him that I would be taking an indefinite leave of absence, citing unforeseen personal developments involving the reappearance of my wife and the subsequent discovery of systemic financial irregularities involving several prominent board donors. The implication was a tactical strike. By tying my personal tragedy to the names of the people who funded the hospital, people who sat on boards with Arthur, I was making the scandal radioactive. No one would want to be near the blast zone. I felt a strange, cold satisfaction. My life as I knew it was over. My career, my home, my social standing, all of it was being sacrificed to fuel the fire I was building. But I had realized in that kitchen that I didn't want the life they had given me back. It was a counterfeit. I looked at the clock. 3:00 a.m. In 4 hours, the workday would begin, and the emails, the packages, and the legal threats I had set in motion would begin to land. The structure of their world was held together by the silence of good men. I was no longer a good man. I was a man who understood that sometimes, to save the patient, you have to amputate the limb. I picked up a scalpel from my desk, a ceremonial one, gifted to me after my 100th successful reconstruction. I turned it over in my hand, the steel cool and indifferent. I wasn't going to use it on anyone. I didn't need to. The truth was a much sharper instrument, and I had just finished honing the edge. I closed my laptop and grabbed my coat. The first layer of revenge was complete. The secondary betrayers were in a state of collapse. Tomorrow, I would turn my attention back to the center of the circle. I would return to the house in the rain, but this time, I wouldn't be looking for my daughter. I would be looking for the man I used to be, so I could tell him he was finally free of the lie. The drive back to the motel was quiet. The city was beginning to wake up, the first hints of dawn bleaching the sky. I felt a sense of purpose that surgery had never given me. For years, I had been fixing what others had broken. Now I was the one doing the breaking, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was finally operating with a steady hand. In the world of structural engineering, there is a phenomenon known as progressive collapse. It occurs when a local failure of a primary structural component leads to the collapse of adjoining members, which in turn leads to further collapse until the entire building, or a disproportionate part of it, is reduced to rubble. It is a chain reaction of gravity and physics. I spent the morning of the 3rd day watching the first floor of Arthur's carefully constructed life begin to give way. I had returned to the city, but not to my house. I was operating out of a rented SUV, a mobile command center that smelled of stale upholstery and high-octane espresso. My laptop was tethered to a secure hotspot, and the ledger Marcus had delivered, scanned and sent in a fit of stuttering panic at 4:00 a.m., was open on my screen. It was more comprehensive than I had anticipated. It was a roadmap of 3 years of quiet checks offshore accounts, and consultation fees paid to individuals who had no professional reason to consult with a retired investment banker. My first stop was the country club. It was the social heart of Arthur and Lydia's world, a place where reputations were polished more frequently than the silverware. I didn't go inside to cause a scene. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I simply parked in the guest lot and waited for the morning rush of the executive committee. When Arthur's closest associate, a man named Sterling who chaired the regional hospital board, exited his car, I met him at the bag drop. I didn't offer a greeting. I handed him a manila envelope. "David," Sterling said, his eyes darting toward the clubhouse entrance. "I heard about the situation. Truly tragic. We were all so shocked." "The shock is just the initial impact, Sterling," I said, my voice as flat as a cardiac monitor's tone. "The trauma comes later, when you realize the extent of the internal damage. Inside that envelope is a record of the donations Arthur made to the hospital's foundation over the last 3 years. Cross-referenced with the funds moved through Marcus Thorne's firm. You'll find that the money used to name the new pediatric wing was originally diverted from my daughter's trust." Sterling's face took on a grayish, doughy quality. He clutched the envelope as if it were a radioactive isotope. "David, this is a private matter. We can resolve this quietly." "Quietly is how we got here, Sterling. From now on, I only operate in high-resolution light." I turned and walked away before he could formulate a rebuttal. I knew that by noon, the executive committee would be meeting to discuss liability mitigation. Arthur would be asked to resign his honorary memberships. The social erasure had begun. By 2 p.m., I moved from social consequences to property. Revenge, when executed correctly, should feel like an inevitable consequence of one's own actions. Arthur and Lydia prided themselves on their estate, the colonial on the hill. It was more than a house. It was a monument to their perceived superiority. I arrived at the property while I knew they were in the city, meeting with their legal counsel. The house sat silent, a sprawling fortress of white brick and dark shutters. I didn't break a window. I didn't force a lock. I used the key I had been given years ago, the one they had never asked to be returned, because they thought I was too broken to ever use it again. I walked through the rooms with a roll of heavy-duty industrial tape and a canister of professional-grade plumbing sealant. I didn't destroy furniture. I didn't slash paintings. I went for the infrastructure. I spent an hour in the basement, carefully adjusting the pressure valves on the main water line and the HVAC system. I didn't break them. I calibrated them for failure. I set the humidifiers to maximum and blocked the drainage vents with precision-cut foam. In a house of that age, with that much wood and that many delicate antiques, a sudden, sustained increase in humidity followed by a localized moisture release is more devastating than a fire. It is a slow, creeping ruin. It warps the floorboards, peels the wallpaper, and invites a permanent musty rot into the very bones of the building. It turns a mansion into a mold trap. As I worked, I felt a sense of rhythmic calm. I was applying the same focus I used during a 10-hour spinal fusion. I was ensuring that the environment they had used to hide Elena would become uninhabitable. It was an act of environmental justice. I finished in the library, Arthur's sanctuary. I didn't touch his books. I simply moved his desk 3 inches to the left, just enough to be perceptible, just enough to signal that someone had been in his private space and moved his world without his permission. On the center of the green blotter, I left a single item, the flattened, jagged remains of my wedding ring. The message was clear. The circle is broken, and I am the one who bent it. I exited the house and drove to the offices of the Preservation Society where Lydia held court. I didn't ask for a meeting. I sat in the lobby and waited until she emerged for her afternoon tea. When she saw me, she stopped mid-sentence, her face tightening into a mask of polite horror. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. This is highly inappropriate. You cannot come here. I'm just here to return some history, Lydia, I said. I stood up, towering over her. I didn't raise my voice, but the people in the lobby began to go silent, sensing the atmospheric pressure drop. I've sent a digital archive to your board members. It includes the correspondence between you and the private clinic in Switzerland, where Elena spent her first year of reflection. It also includes the invoices you paid to keep her existence off the grid. You have no right, she hissed, her eyes darting to the receptionist. Rights are a legal construct, Lydia. I'm operating on a more primal set of laws. You stole 3 years of my daughter's life. I'm simply returning the favor by ensuring you spend your remaining years as a social pariah. Every person in this building now knows that your philanthropy is funded by the same money you used to kidnap a child's reality. I left her there, standing in the center of the lobby, the weight of 100 staring eyes beginning to press in on her. She had spent a lifetime perfecting her image. I had destroyed it in 90 seconds. As evening fell, I returned to the SUV. My phone was a constant vibration of alerts. Arthur was calling. Elena was calling. The lawyers were calling. I ignored them all. I drove to the outskirts of the city, to a bridge that overlooked the industrial district. I needed a moment of silence to prepare for the final act. I thought about the physical toll this was taking. I hadn't eaten in 24 hours. My hands were stained with dust and sealant, but the exhaustion felt like a purification. I was shedding the skin of the man who had been a victim. I was becoming something else, a force of pure, directed consequence. I received a text from my investigator. They moved her, the message read. Arthur and Elena. They're at the lodge. No security. Just them. They were trying to regroup. They were trying to find a new place to hide, a new structure to inhabit. They thought that by moving, they could escape the collapse I had triggered in the city. They didn't understand that the collapse wasn't happening in the city, it was happening inside them. I had already compromised their foundations. The location didn't matter. I started the engine. The drive to the lake would take 2 hours. I checked the cargo area of my vehicle. I had everything I needed for the final confrontation. Not weapons. I didn't need them. I had the truth. I had the financial records, and I had the physical evidence of their 3-year fraud. But more than that, I had the surgical knowledge of where to strike. I thought about Maya, safe at my colleague's house, watching a movie and eating popcorn, blissfully unaware that her world had been dismantled and was being rebuilt by a father she barely recognized. I was doing this for her, but I was also doing it for the man who had sat in that kitchen and realized he had been living in a dollhouse designed by his enemies. The rain started again, a light mist that blurred the windshield. I turned on the wipers, the steady rhythm matching the pulse in my neck. Swish, swish, swish. It was the sound of a clock ticking down. It was the sound of a structure reaching its limit. I reached the turnoff for the lake road. It was a narrow, winding path through dense trees. The lodge was a private retreat, a place Arthur used for high-stakes negotiations. He thought he was on home turf. He thought he could negotiate his way out of this. He was wrong. In my theater, there is no negotiation with a failing heart. There is no compromise with a shattered limb. There is only the work, and my work was nearly finished. I pulled into the gravel drive, my headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal Arthur's silver SUV and the warm, inviting glow of the cabin windows. It looked peaceful. It looked like a place where a family could heal. It was a lie. And I was there to tear it down. I stepped out of the car, the cool mountain air filling my lungs. I felt a strange sense of empathy for them in that moment, the empathy a surgeon feels for a patient before the first incision. They had no idea how much this was going to hurt. They had no idea that by the time I was finished, there wouldn't be enough left of their lives to even constitute a memory. I walked toward the door, my footsteps heavy on the wet wood of the porch. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the handle and turned. The final meeting was about to begin, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the only one in the room who knew exactly how it was going to end. The lodge was constructed of cedar and stone, designed to look rugged while providing every possible luxury. It was a place where powerful men came to feel like they were roughing it, unaware that the air was filtered and the water was softened. I pushed the door open, the heavy timber yielding to my shoulder. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and expensive red wine. Arthur was standing by the fireplace, a glass in his hand, while Elena sat on a leather sofa, her face illuminated by the amber glow of the embers. They both froze. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a structure under too much tension, the microfractures screaming just below the frequency of human hearing. "David," Arthur said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly authority. He set his glass on the mantel. "You've crossed a line. Coming to the house was one thing, but tracking us here, this is harassment. We have a legal team already drafting a restraining order." "A restraining order requires a credible threat of violence, Arthur," I said, walking into the center of the room. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't want to get comfortable in their sanctuary. "I haven't raised my hand to anyone. I haven't even raised my voice. I'm simply here to deliver the final prognosis. The patient, your family's reputation, is beyond saving." Elena stood up. She looked smaller here, stripped of the manicured perfection of her parents' sunroom. "Why can't you just let it go? I left because I couldn't breathe, David. I was drowning in the life we had. My parents offered me a way out that didn't involve a messy public collapse. It was supposed to be a clean break." "A clean break," I repeated. The irony was a physical weight. In surgery, a clean break is an amputation. You didn't just leave me, Elena. You erased yourself. You let Maya believe her mother had vanished into thin air. You sat in a guest suite 20 miles away while I searched the hospitals and the morgues. That isn't a clean break. That's a psychological demolition." "I was protecting her," Elena snapped, her composure finally cracking. "Protecting her from the person you are, the man who cares more about his charts and his titanium screws than the people in his own house." "Is that what they told you?" I asked. I looked at Arthur, who was watching me with a calculated wariness. "Or is that the story you tell yourself so you can sleep at night?" I pulled a thick folder from my coat pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a dull thud. "I spent the last 48 hours talking to the people you thought were your friends, Elena. I talked to Marcus. I talked to Sarah. I even talked to the staff at that retreat you went to in Switzerland." Arthur moved toward the table, but I stepped in front of him. I am taller than he is, and younger. I didn't have to be aggressive to be an obstacle. "You see, Elena," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, clinical tone, "I found something interesting in the financial records. Your parents didn't just offer you a way out. They bought you. They've been subsidizing your entire existence because they knew if you left the traditional way, if you filed for divorce and stayed in the city, they'd lose control over Maya. They'd lose the image of the perfect, multi-generational dynasty." I turned back to Elena, whose face was becoming a mask of confusion. "They told you I was the one who wouldn't let you go. They told you I was the one threatening to take Maya away. But looking at these ledgers, I see the truth. They were the ones who kept you in that guest suite. They were the ones who told you the police were still looking for you as a suspect in a financial crime that never happened. They created a trap and called it a sanctuary." The twist hit her like a physical blow. She looked at Arthur, her eyes searching his face for a denial that didn't come. Arthur didn't look at her. He looked at the fireplace, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. "Is that true?" Elena whispered. "The investigation, the threat of the authorities, was that all just to keep me there?" "We did what was necessary for the family, Elena," Arthur said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You were unstable. You were going to ruin everything we built. We provided you with comfort and safety. We ensured Maya was raised with the proper values. The proper values? I said, a dry, sarcastic laugh escaping my throat. Like lying, like manipulation, like the systemic destruction of a man's life for the sake of a country club membership. I walked over to the side table where a collection of framed photos sat, the lodge memories. I picked up a silver-framed picture of Maya and Elena, taken during their secret time together over the last 3 years. I didn't break the glass. I didn't smash the frame. I simply turned it face down. Here is the reality, Arthur, I said, turning back to him. The merger you've been working on? It was predicated on your personal integrity. The board received a full report this afternoon detailing your misuse of family trust funds to facilitate Elena's disappearance. Your firm is currently being audited by 3 different regulatory bodies. Your honorary status at the hospital has been revoked, and the Colonial on the Hill, it's currently being inspected for a massive structural and environmental failure that I doubt your insurance will cover. Arthur's face went from pale to a deep, mottled purple. He took a step toward me, his hand balled into a fist. You think you can just walk in here and take everything? You're a doctor. You're nothing without the infrastructure we provided. I'm a trauma surgeon, Arthur. I thrive in the wreckage. I turned to Elena. She was crying now, but it wasn't the performative crying I had seen before. It was the sound of a person realizing they had traded their soul for a cage. You have a choice, Elena, I said. You can stay here with the people who lied to you to keep you under their thumb, or you can leave, but you aren't coming with me. Maya and I are moving. I've already signed the papers for a position in a different state. You'll hear from my lawyers regarding the custody arrangements, which will be dictated entirely by the evidence of your 3-year abandonment. David, please, she sobbed. I didn't know. They told me you were the danger. And you believed them because it was easier than facing the reality of our marriage, I said. I wasn't perfect, but I was real. This is all fiction. I walked toward the door, my work here finished. I had achieved the peak of the confrontation. I had stripped them of their secrets, their reputations, and their leverage over one another. I had turned the architects of the lie against themselves. You can't do this, Arthur shouted after me, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling of the lodge. I'll bury you. I have resources you can't even imagine. I stopped at the threshold and looked back. The fire was fading, the room falling into shadow. Your resources are numbers on a screen, Arthur. My resources are the facts, and unlike you, I know exactly how to use a knife. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place was final. I walked to my SUV, the rain washing the smell of wood smoke from my coat. I felt a strange, hollowed-out lightness. The surgery was over. The damaged tissue had been removed. What remained would be scarred, but it would be functional. As I drove away from the lake, I saw the lights of the lodge in my rearview mirror. They looked small and flickering against the vast darkness of the forest. Inside that building, 3 people were now trapped with the truth of what they had done to each other. They would spend the rest of the night, and likely the rest of their lives, trying to figure out who to blame. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of the house where Maya was staying. Hey, kiddo, I said when the call connected. My voice was steady, the sarcasm gone, replaced by a quiet, unbreakable resolve. Pack your bags. We're going on a trip, just the 2 of us. Where are we going, Daddy? She asked, her voice sounding clearer than it had in days. Somewhere with a new foundation, I said. Somewhere where we don't have to worry about the rain. I hung up the phone and pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The road ahead was dark and winding, but for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly where I was going. The structure of my old life was gone, reduced to rubble and dust. But as I watched the miles disappear behind me, I realized that I didn't miss it. I was a surgeon. I knew that sometimes, to save the patient, you have to let the old version of them go. I reached the highway and merged into the flow of traffic. I was just another driver in the night, another soul moving through the world. But I was moving with purpose. I was moving with the cold, hard clarity of a man who had looked into the abyss and realized it was just an empty room. The final act was complete. The revenge wasn't a single moment of violence. It was a slow, systemic erasure of the people who had tried to erase me. I had taken their money, their homes, their reputations, and their trust in one another. I had left them with nothing but the truth. And in the end, that was the most devastating consequence of all. The story ends here. There is no epilogue. There is no redemption. There is only the road, the rain, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a heart that has finally stopped hurting. The dawn that followed the confrontation at the lodge was not a sunrise. It was merely a gradual transition from black to a bruised, heavy gray. I didn't sleep. Sleep is for people whose lives are in a state of rest, and mine was currently undergoing a high-velocity repositioning. I spent the early hours in a diner on the edge of the county, the kind of place where the coffee is strong enough to dissolve a surgical staple, and the waitresses don't ask why your dress shirt is ruined by rain and sweat. I had my laptop open, finishing the final sequence of the demolition. In trauma surgery, the most dangerous moment isn't the initial impact. It's the secondary reperfusion injury, the damage caused when circulation returns to tissue that has been deprived of oxygen for too long. My in-laws and my wife were about to experience the social equivalent. For 3 years, they had existed in a vacuum of their own making. Now, I was forcing the world back in, and the pressure change would be catastrophic. I hit send on the final batch of encrypted files. These went to the Internal Revenue Compliance Division and the State Bar Association's investigative branch. It wasn't just a list of grievances, it was a forensic map of 3 years of money laundering disguised as family support. Arthur's firm wouldn't just be audited, it would be dismantled. The resources he had bragged about were being frozen by the very systems he had spent a lifetime trying to game. By 9 a.m., I was back in the city, standing across the street from the regional hospital where I had spent the better part of a decade. I watched as the local news vans began to congregate near the entrance. The press release I had leaked, anonymously, through a series of shell servers, didn't mention me. It mentioned the financial irregularities and ethical breaches involving the hospital's largest private donors and the mysterious reappearance of a woman long thought to be a victim of foul play. The story was too perfect for them to ignore. It had everything: wealth, a long-term conspiracy, and the spectacular fall of a local dynasty. I saw Sterling, the board chairman, exit the building. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 24 hours. He was surrounded by reporters, their microphones thrust toward him like spears. He didn't have answers. You can't provide an answer for a lie that has become the foundation of your institution. I turned away from the spectacle and drove to the Colonial on the Hill. I didn't go to the front door this time. I sat in my car at the end of the driveway and watched the final physical manifestation of my work. A crew from the municipal water department was already there, along with a structural inspector. The calibrations I had made to the plumbing and HVAC systems had worked with mathematical certainty. In the time it had taken for Arthur and Lydia to drive back from the lake, the internal pressure had forced a series of pipe failures in the third-floor walls. Thousands of gallons of water had cascaded through the plaster, soaking the antique rugs, warping the hand-carved mahogany banisters, and turning the library into a swamp of gray pulp and mold. The house wasn't falling down, but it was being condemned. The moisture had triggered a massive electrical short in the vintage wiring, and the smell of ozone and wet rot was perceptible even from the street. I saw Lydia standing on the lawn, her hands pressed to her cheeks, watching as men in yellow vests carried out armloads of ruined history. She looked like a ghost in her own life, a woman who had spent 40 years building a museum only to have the exhibits dissolve in her hands. Arthur arrived 20 minutes later. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at the house. He sat in his silver SUV, staring at the screen of his phone. He was likely watching his net worth evaporate as the regulatory freezes took hold. He was a man of numbers, and the numbers were all returning to zero. I put the car in gear and drove past them slowly. I didn't honk. I didn't wave. I simply looked at Arthur as I passed. For a fleeting second, our eyes met. He saw me, the man he thought he had successfully buried in a mountain of paperwork and false sympathy. He saw the surgeon who had finally finished the operation. I didn't feel joy. I felt the cold, quiet satisfaction of a job performed according to the specifications. My final stop was the storage unit I had rented 2 days prior. I met the private investigator there. He handed me a single heavy box. "Everything?" I asked. "Everything that wasn't digital," he said. "The journal she kept at the retreat, the letters Arthur intercepted from you and never showed her, and the original deed to the property they bought in her name while she was missing. It's all there. The complete record of the fraud." "Thank you. What are you going to do with it, Doc? This is enough to put them away for a long time." "I don't need them behind bars," I said, sliding the box into the back of my SUV. "The bars are already there. They're living in them now. I just want to make sure they never forget the view." I drove to the house where Maya was waiting. She was standing on the porch, her small suitcase by her side. She looked at me, her eyes searching for the man I used to be. I knelt down and hugged her, her small arms wrapping around my neck. "Is it over, Daddy?" she asked. "It's over, Maya. We're going now." "Are we coming back?" "No," I said. "There's nothing left here to come back to." As we hit the interstate, heading west toward a life that hadn't been scripted by someone else, I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. It was Arthur's personal record of favors owed, the book that held the social and financial leverage of half the city. I didn't keep it. I didn't use it for blackmail. That would have required me to stay connected to their world. Instead, I drove to a rest stop overlooking a deep, fast-moving river. I walked to the edge of the overlook, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I took the ledger and ripped the pages out, one by one. I watched as the secrets of the city's elite caught the wind, fluttering like wounded birds before dropping into the churning water below. The names, the debts, the hidden transactions, all of it was being reclaimed by the current. I took the journals Elena had written, the ones filled with her self-justifications and her parents' coached lies, and I let them go too. The final item was a small, velvet-lined box I had found in the lodge. It contained a set of pearls Arthur had given Elena to celebrate her 1-year anniversary of being away, a reward for a successful deception. I didn't throw them. I placed them on the concrete railing and, using the heavy handle of my surgical kit, I crushed them into a fine white powder. I stood there until the last of the paper had vanished around the bend of the river. The air was cold, and the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world feeling scrubbed and raw. I felt a strange sense of equilibrium. The trauma had been addressed, the infection had been excised. The recovery would be long and difficult, but the vitals were stable. I walked back to the car. Maya was asleep in the back, her head resting against the window. I climbed into the driver's seat and looked at my hands. They were steady. They were clean. I put the car in drive and merged into the sunset. Behind me, a city was waking up to a scandal that would dominate the headlines for months. A family was sitting in the ruins of a condemned mansion, surrounded by the wreckage of their own arrogance. A wife was realizing that her escape had been a trap, and her sanctuary had been a cell. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had spent 3 years living in a story written by my enemies. Now, the ink was dry, the book was closed, and I was the only one who knew how to turn the page. The road stretched out before me, a long black ribbon of possibility. I didn't have a plan beyond the next 500 miles. I didn't have a home. I didn't have a career. But as the lights of the city faded into a tiny, flickering glow in the distance, I realized I had something far more valuable. I had the truth, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the blade. I reached out and turned on the radio, finding a station that played nothing but the low, rhythmic hum of the road. I settled into the seat, my eyes fixed on the horizon. The structure was gone, the foundation was destroyed. I am a surgeon. I know that the most beautiful things are often the ones we have to build from scratch. The silence wasn't an absence of sound, it was the final, perfect measurement of my success.